14-year-old girl disappears in the middle of the night. Her photograph flashes across television screens nationwide, seen by millions of viewers on MTV. For 30 years, an entire community believes she simply ran away from home. But what if the answer was buried just feet away from where her family ate breakfast every morning? What if the person who knew exactly what happened was the same person who reported her missing? Tonight, we're going to take you inside one of the most disturbing cold cases in Michigan history. A case where a mother's intuition turned out to be absolutely correct, where genetic genealogy cracked a 40-year-old murder case wide open, and where a predator hid in plain sight for decades, volunteering at church and teaching Sunday school while harboring the darkest of secrets. This is the story of Andrea Bowman. And I need to warn you, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about the people living next door, attending your church, and raising families in your community. Because sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are the ones who know exactly how to blend in. Before we begin this journey together, I want to ask you something. Do you believe someone could commit unthinkable acts and then live a normal life for decades, sitting across the dinner table from their own family, never revealing what they've done? Do you think it's possible for someone to bury their darkest secret in their own backyard and walk past it every single day for 30 years without showing a trace of guilt? After tonight, you might see your neighbors differently. You might question those picture-perfect families just a little bit more. And you might understand why investigators say that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who appear the most normal. So settle in, because this case has everything. Multiple states, multiple victims spanning decades, a birth mother who never stopped searching, an online sleuth who connected impossible dots, and a breakthrough that came from a discarded water bottle nearly 4 decades after a brutal crime. This is the untold cold case, and this is the story of how a monster finally got caught. Our story doesn't begin in Michigan. It doesn't begin with a disappearance. It begins much earlier, in 1972, with a teenage girl in Virginia who was desperately trying to escape her own life. Her name was Kathy Turkanian, and at that time, she was just a child herself. Living with parents who made it painfully clear that they viewed her as nothing more than a burden, Kathy made the difficult decision that so many desperate teenagers have made throughout history. She ran away from home. Picture this: a young girl, barely more than a child, hitchhiking along highways with absolutely no money in her pockets. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a destination. She just knew she couldn't stay where she was. She traveled mile after mile, accepting rides from strangers, until she finally reached Memphis, Tennessee. In Memphis, Kathy met a 19-year-old named Randy Badger. To a frightened runaway with nowhere to go, Randy must have seemed like a lifeline. He offered her stability, or at least what passed for stability in their chaotic young lives. In December of that same year, the young couple made their way to South Carolina. Now, you might be wondering why they chose South Carolina specifically. The answer is simple but disturbing. The laws in that state had a provision that allowed minors to get married if they had parental permission. Kathy reached out to her parents, and their response tells you everything you need to know about her childhood. They provided permission gladly. They were eager, almost relieved to wash their hands of any legal responsibility for their daughter. They essentially signed paperwork that said she was someone else's problem now. The marriage was brief and troubled from the start. These were two young people who barely knew each other, trying to build a life they weren't prepared for. Less than a year into the marriage, Kathy discovered she was pregnant. On June 23, 1974, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Alexis. For a brief moment, Kathy must have felt hope. She had created a new life, a fresh start, a chance to give this child everything she herself had never received. But the instability that had defined Kathy's entire young life didn't magically disappear. By the time baby Alexis reached just 5 months old, Kathy and Randy had separated. The marriage was over. Kathy, now a single teenage mother, returned to her parents' home in Virginia. She was hoping desperately for some kind of safety net, some kind of support system that would help her get back on her feet. But she found absolutely none of that waiting for her. It became painfully, devastatingly clear very quickly that she would receive no financial support whatsoever. No emotional support. No help with childcare. Nothing. She was essentially still a child herself, trying to raise a baby in a home that didn't want either of them there. Can you imagine being in that position? You're barely out of childhood yourself. You have an infant who depends entirely on you for survival. And you're living under a roof where you're made to feel like a burden every single day. Kathy looked at her baby daughter and had to face an agonizing truth. She could not provide the life she desperately wanted for this child. She didn't have education. She didn't have job skills. She didn't have money or family support. And her daughter deserved so much more than what Kathy could give her at that moment. So Kathy made what might be the hardest decision any mother can make. When baby Alexis was just 9 months old, when she was just beginning to babble and recognize her mother's face, Kathy surrendered her to the adoption system in Norfolk, Virginia. It was what's called a closed adoption. And if you're not familiar with that term, it essentially means a final legal door was shutting forever between mother and child. There would be no contact, no updates, no photographs, no information about where the child went or who adopted her. It was a complete severing of the relationship. Kathy walked away from that adoption agency, clinging to one single fragile hope. She told herself that one day, when her daughter was grown, when Alexis was an adult who could make her own choices, maybe she would come looking for the mother who gave her up. Maybe she would understand that Kathy had made this impossible choice out of love, not abandonment. That hope was all Kathy had to hold on to for the next several decades. Now, while Kathy was making the hardest decision of her young life in Virginia, something very different was happening several hundred miles away in Holland, Michigan. A couple named Dennis and Brenda Bowman were actively searching for a child to complete their family. And from the outside looking in, they appeared to be exactly the kind of stable, loving family that adoption agencies dream of placing children with. Let me paint you a picture of how the Bowmans presented themselves to their community. They lived at the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street, in a farmhouse surrounded by the quiet, rolling farmland of Ottawa County. They were the picture of Midwestern stability and Christian values. Dennis was a former Navy reservist, which gave him an automatic air of respectability in a community that valued military service. He had reddish-brown hair, a neatly trimmed goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly and intelligent. He worked as a wood machinist, which was solid, respectable blue-collar work. Brenda had curled bangs in the style popular at the time. She was a woman who had previously worked the jewelry counter at the local Meyer department store, which meant people in town knew her, had interacted with her, found her friendly and helpful. But here's what really gave the Bowmans credibility in their community. They were fixtures at their local church. And I don't just mean they attended services on Sunday morning. They were actively involved. They taught Sunday school to children. They volunteered for church activities. They maintained impeccable appearances as a pious, God-fearing couple. In a small, tight-knit community like Holland, Michigan in the 1980s, that kind of church involvement was like a stamp of approval. It said, "These are good people. These are people you can trust." Dennis and Brenda desperately wanted to become parents, but biology had placed a significant barrier in their path. Brenda suffered from a rare medical condition involving complications with her reproductive system. The condition made conception extremely difficult and made carrying a pregnancy to term even more unlikely. After years of disappointment, after tests and treatments and hope that kept getting crushed, they made the decision to turn to adoption agencies. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The agencies matched the Bowmans with Kathy's infant daughter. The baby who had been named Alexis was brought into the Bowman home. And here's where that closed adoption becomes so significant. The Bowmans completely renamed the child. She was no longer Alexis. She became Andrea Michelle Bowman. Before her first birthday, before she could even speak or form memories, the identity of Alexis had been completely erased. She was now legally, officially, and in every way that mattered, the daughter of Dennis and Brenda Bowman. She was growing up in rural Michigan, attending a local church, being raised in what appeared to be the quiet, stable, religious environment that Kathy had dreamed of for her daughter when she made that impossible choice to give her up. For nearly 14 years, Andrea was the sole focus of the Bowman household. She was an only child, which in many families means being treasured and perhaps even slightly spoiled. All the attention, all the resources, all the hopes and dreams were focused on this one child. But then, in January of 1988, something happened that would dramatically shift the entire dynamic inside the Bowman home. Against all medical odds, against every diagnosis and prognosis Brenda had received over the years, she carried a pregnancy to term. The couple welcomed a healthy second daughter into the world. They named her Vanessa. Now, in most families, the arrival of a new baby is celebrated. The older child might feel a little jealous at first, might need some reassurance that they're still loved, but generally it's a happy transition. But the arrival of baby Vanessa completely transformed Andrea's life in ways that went far beyond normal sibling dynamics. Andrea went from being an only child, the center of attention, to stepping into a role that was far heavier than simple big sister. Duties. She became in many ways a third parent in the household, and she was only 13 years old, while other girls her age were joining after-school clubs, trying out for sports teams, attending Friday night football games, going to the mall with friends, and navigating the normal social landscape of adolescence. Andrea spent her afternoons and weekends at home. She changed diapers. She washed bottles. She constantly tended to the baby. She was expected to help in ways that went far beyond what most teenagers are asked to do. And over time, whispers began to circulate in the community about what was really happening inside the Bowman home. One incident in particular fueled these rumors. It happened when Andrea was in middle school. She boarded the school bus one morning, and other students noticed something disturbing. There was visible evidence of injury on her wrist. Now, remember, this is a small community. News travels fast, especially among teenagers. Some students began whispering that Andrea had attempted to take her own life. Others claimed she had injured herself while trying to climb back into her own house through a window after Dennis and Brenda had locked her out as punishment for something. There were stories about Dennis's temper, about the strict, almost suffocating level of control he seemed to exert over the entire household, about rules that seemed excessive even by the standards of conservative religious families. But here's the thing you have to understand about that time and that particular community. What happened behind closed doors was almost universally dismissed as private family business. There was a very strong cultural reluctance to interfere in how other people raised their children, especially when that family appeared to be upstanding church-going folks. If the Bowmans showed up to church every Sunday, if they taught Sunday school, if they appeared to be living according to Christian values, well then, who were neighbors to question how they ran their household? This attitude, this reluctance to get involved, would turn out to have absolutely tragic consequences. March 11th, 1989. Remember that date, because it's when everything changed. The day started like any other day in the Bowman household. It was a Saturday, and Dennis drove 14-year-old Andrea to school for a band event. Andrea was involved in the school band program, which gave her a rare opportunity to be around other kids, to feel normal, to escape the confines of the farmhouse for a few hours. When Dennis picked her up later that afternoon, students who saw them together later reported that the atmosphere seemed heavy. There was tension. Andrea appeared quiet, withdrawn. Dennis seemed angry about something. That evening, Dennis drove Brenda to her second shift job. Brenda worked nights, which meant the family routine involved a lot of juggling of schedules and childcare responsibilities. Dennis took baby Vanessa with him in the car, specifically so that Andrea could stay home and focus on her homework without having to watch the baby. This detail becomes important later. Remember it. According to Dennis's account, which he gave to police that same night, he returned home with baby Vanessa at approximately 6:30 in the evening. When he pulled into the driveway, he immediately noticed that the farmhouse was completely dark. The silence was absolute. No lights, no television sounds, no music, nothing. He carried the baby inside through the back door, which he found unlocked. He placed Vanessa on the sofa and called out for Andrea. There was no answer. He called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Dennis said he walked through the downstairs rooms, still calling for Andrea. The house felt empty. Finally, he went upstairs to check the bedrooms. When he reached the main bedroom, the door was open. This was significant because, according to Dennis himself, that particular door was usually kept strictly locked. Dennis and Brenda kept their bedroom locked, apparently to prevent Andrea from going in there. Dennis stepped inside and immediately noticed that something was wrong. A small travel suitcase was missing. He checked the drawer where they had recently stashed their tax refund cash, money they had just received in the mail. It was gone. He checked other places where they kept money around the house. Also empty. Even baby Vanessa's piggy bank, which couldn't have contained more than a few dollars in coins, had been emptied out. The immediate conclusion seemed obvious. Andrea had run away, and she had taken everything she could carry and every bit of money she could find to fund her escape. When Brenda's shift ended at 11:30 that night, she came home to the devastating news that her daughter was gone. Brenda's reaction in those first days and weeks appeared to be genuine grief and panic. She spent night after night driving the dark country roads of Ottawa County, scanning the cornfields and empty streets for any sign of Andrea. She drove until exhaustion forced her to stop, searching everywhere she could think of. She only stopped these nightly searches when Dennis told her she had to, reminding her that they still had a baby daughter who needed them to be functional and present. Dennis contacted the police to report Andrea as a missing person. And here's where his version of events becomes really important, because this is the narrative that would shape the entire investigation for the next 30 years. Dennis painted a very specific picture for the police. He described Andrea as a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother. He told them she had actually run away to a friend's house once before, though this was for a very brief period. He emphasized the missing suitcase and the missing money, which seemed to confirm the runaway theory. The police, looking at the situation from their perspective, saw no immediate signs of a struggle in the home. They heard about the missing belongings and money. They listened to a father describing a rebellious teenage daughter, and they made a decision that would haunt this case for decades. They labeled Andrea as a runaway. They passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau, which handled issues with troubled teens, not criminal investigations. In their view, this was a family problem, not a crime. Very few people in Holland who knew the Bowman family questioned this official narrative. Many people in the community simply assumed that Andrea had gotten fed up with her strict home life, with the constant babysitting duties, with Dennis's temper and rules, and had finally decided she had had enough. In the absence of facts, rumors rushed in to fill the void. People whispered that Andrea had gone looking for her birth mother, that she had finally learned she was adopted and was trying to find her biological family. Others said she had hitched a ride at a local truck stop and left town with a truck driver. Some claimed she had run off with an older boy. There were even whispers that she might have been pregnant and was hiding somewhere until she could figure out what to do. Brenda, desperate for any information, reported receiving a series of tips in the weeks and months following Andrea's disappearance. All of these tips seemed to confirm the hope that Andrea was alive somewhere and simply didn't want to be found. Maybe she had been spotted in another town. Maybe someone had seen a girl matching her description. Maybe she had called someone but hung up when they answered. These tips, none of which ever led anywhere concrete, kept the hope alive that Andrea was out there somewhere, living her life, just choosing not to come home. Shortly after the disappearance in 1989, the Bowmans made another significant decision. They left the farmhouse on Lincoln Road. They moved to Hamilton, a small town nestled between Holland and Dorr, starting fresh in a new location. They were leaving behind Andrea's empty bedroom. They were leaving behind the whispers and rumors. They were leaving behind the scene of whatever had really happened that night. A single photograph became the public face of the missing girl. It was a school photo that had been given to police when Andrea first vanished, and it's the image that most people still associate with this case today. In the photograph, Andrea sits against a simple blue studio backdrop, the kind that every school in America uses for picture day. She's looking just slightly off camera with her striking green eyes cast upward. There's something about her expression that people found haunting. She looks vulnerable. Young. A little bit sad, perhaps, though that might be us projecting what we now know onto an innocent school photograph. During this era, photos of missing children were often printed on the sides of milk cartons. You'd pour your cereal in the morning and there would be a child's face looking up at you from the breakfast table. Or they'd be on flyers taped to the tops of pizza delivery boxes, so that every time someone ordered dinner, they'd be confronted with these missing faces. But Andrea's picture ended up somewhere completely different, somewhere that would eventually reach far more people than a milk carton ever could. In 1993, 4 years after Andrea disappeared, the alternative rock band Soul Asylum released a music video for their song, Runaway Train. Now, the song itself was powerful, dealing with themes of depression and desperation, but the video was something entirely different. The directors made a deliberate choice to feature real missing children in the video. They created multiple versions that would air in different regions, each featuring children missing from that specific area. It was an innovative use of the music video format as a tool for social awareness. The video became an absolute cultural phenomenon. It was in heavy rotation on MTV and VH1, which at that time were enormously influential. Millions of people, especially teenagers and young adults, watched MTV religiously. The Runaway Train video became unavoidable. You couldn't flip past music television without seeing it multiple times a day. In the version that aired in the Michigan region, Andrea's school photograph appeared at approximately the 2-minute mark in the video. For just a few seconds while the song played, viewers across the Midwest saw her face flash across their television screens. The director of the video, a man named Tony Kaye, would later claim something remarkable. He stated that more than 24 missing children were found as a direct result of that video being broadcast on national television. People recognized faces. They called in tips. Families were reunited. It was an incredible success story for using popular media to help solve real-world problems. Unfortunately, tragically, Andrea Bowman was not one of those success stories. The song eventually faded from the charts, as all popular songs eventually do. The video stopped being in heavy rotation. MTV moved on to other videos, other bands, other trends. And Andrea's case, which had briefly been visible to millions of people, went completely cold. The years passed. 1994 became 1995, became 2000, became 2005. A decade passed. Then another. Andrea Bowman became just another name in the national database of missing persons, one of thousands of unsolved disappearances that haunt law enforcement agencies across the country. Her case file gathered dust. The leads dried up completely. And in Holland, Michigan, people slowly stopped talking about the teenage girl who had run away that night in March of 1989. The disappearance of Andrea Bowman might have remained forever unsolved, if not for the emergence of new technology and the dedication of amateur investigators who refused to let cold cases stay cold. Enter Carl Koppelman, a name that true crime enthusiasts might recognize. Carl was what we call a web sleuth, an amateur detective whose deep interest in unsolved cases led him to spend countless hours trying to help bring closure to families. In 2010, Carl was actively involved in Web Sleuths, which was one of the premier online forums where hobbyists, retired law enforcement, and amateur detectives collaborated on unsolved cases. These forums had become incredibly valuable resources, bringing fresh eyes and new perspectives to cases that official investigators had long since stopped actively working. Carl developed a specific methodology for his research. He spent enormous amounts of time scrolling through NamUs, which is the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database. This is a comprehensive database that tracks both missing persons and unidentified remains found across the United States. Carl's approach was to work at what he called the intersection of the disappeared and the deceased. He was trying to match the characteristics of missing persons with the remains of unidentified bodies that had been found. It was painstaking work that required attention to detail, patience, and a certain kind of mindset that could handle the grim reality of what he was looking at. Carl noticed something that bothered him deeply. Many unidentified remains were in such condition that it was extremely difficult for families to identify them. even if they suspected the remains might be their missing loved one. The forensic photographs were often disturbing and didn't really show what the person had looked like in life. So Carl started doing something remarkable. He began creating lifelike digital renderings of Jane and John Doe's based on the post-mortem photographs. He used photo editing software to essentially reverse engineer what these people might have looked like when they were alive. He posted his work online, hoping desperately that someone, somewhere, might recognize one of these faces. It was during this extensive research that Carl became particularly fixated on one specific case, the Racine County Jane Doe. This young woman had been discovered in 1999 near the edge of a Wisconsin cornfield. The circumstances were immediately suspicious. She had been deceased for approximately 12 hours when she was found, and the condition of the scene suggested that she had been killed elsewhere, and her body had been dumped at that location. Rain had washed away critical evidence that might have helped investigators. They had very little to work with. The autopsy painted an absolutely heartbreaking picture of this young woman's life. The medical examiner believed she may have been cognitively disabled, which would have made her particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Her body showed unmistakable evidence of long-term abuse and neglect. There were signs of previously broken bones that had healed without proper medical treatment. She had what's called cauliflower ear, which is a deformity that typically comes from repeated trauma to the ear. This was someone who had clearly suffered for a long time before her death. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt that had red flowers embroidered on it. This detail became important because that shirt was distinctive enough that investigators hoped someone might recognize it. Here's something that really captures the tragedy of this case. More than 50 people from the local farming community attended her funeral. Think about that. 50 people who had never met this woman, who had no connection to her, took time out of their lives to attend the funeral of a complete stranger because they couldn't bear the thought of her being buried with no one there to mourn her. That's the kind of thing that restores your faith in humanity, even in the darkest cases. Carl began methodically working through potential matches for this Jane Doe. He plugged in his search criteria into the NamUs database: female, specific age range, geographic location within a reasonable distance from where the body was found. He filtered and cross-referenced and eliminated possibilities one by one. Most searches led to dead ends. The characteristics didn't quite match. The timeline didn't work. The geographic distance was too great. But then one entry made Carl stop scrolling completely. Andrea Bowman. Carl's mind started racing as he looked at the details. The timeline aligned perfectly. Andrea had disappeared in March of 1989. The Racine County Jane Doe was found in 1999. That meant if Andrea had survived her disappearance and had been living somewhere for those 10 years, she would have been exactly 25 years old when the Jane Doe was discovered. The age matched perfectly. Then Carl looked at geography. Holland, Michigan, where Andrea had disappeared from, sat directly across Lake Michigan from Racine County, Wisconsin, where the Jane Doe had been found. If you drove around the southern tip of Lake Michigan, it was only about a 4-hour trip. That's nothing. That's an easy distance for someone to travel, whether voluntarily or otherwise. Carl felt that electric sensation that researchers get when they think they might have found something significant. He immediately presented his theory to law enforcement, laying out all the connections he had found. Law enforcement officials reviewed Carl's work and agreed that this potential match was compelling enough to warrant a formal investigation. They needed to pursue this lead. To confirm whether the Racine County Jane Doe was actually Andrea Bowman, investigators needed DNA. But here's where things got complicated. Andrea had been adopted, which meant that Dennis and Brenda Bowman were not her biological parents. Their DNA wouldn't tell investigators anything useful. The police needed to locate Andrea's birth mother. They needed to find Kathy. In April of 2010, 21 years after Andrea disappeared, an official letter arrived at Kathy Turkanian's home in Virginia. You can imagine Kathy's confusion when she saw an envelope from a police department in Michigan. She didn't have any connection to Michigan. Why would police there be contacting her? She opened the letter, and her world completely shifted. The letter explained that her biological daughter, whom she had named Alexis over 3 decades earlier and had surrendered for adoption as an infant, had disappeared from her adoptive home in Holland, Michigan, in 1989. The letter went on to explain that authorities believed Andrea might be an unidentified Jane Doe who had been found in Wisconsin. Kathy read this letter over and over, trying to process information that contradicted everything she had believed for more than 30 years. First, she hadn't even known that her daughter's name had been changed to Andrea Bowman. In her mind, in her memories, the baby she had given up was still Alexis. She had spent 3 decades wondering where Alexis was, what kind of life she was living, whether she was happy. And now she was learning that Alexis had become Andrea, and that Andrea had been missing for over 20 years. The letter asked if Kathy would be willing to provide a DNA sample to help determine if the Jane Doe was her daughter. Of course Kathy was willing. She would have done anything to help. But the letter left her with far more questions than answers, and the questions were eating her alive. Who had raised her daughter? What had Andrea's childhood been like? Why had she disappeared? How had she ended up as an unidentified body in Wisconsin? Desperate for information, Kathy did what many people do in the modern age. She went online. She started searching for everything she could find about Andrea Bowman and her disappearance. She found the school photograph that had appeared in the Runaway Train video. And when Kathy saw that photograph, something inside her just knew. She saw those green eyes looking up at the camera, and she felt an instant, powerful connection. This was her daughter. This was the baby she had held for 9 months before making the heartbreaking decision to give her up. But Kathy desperately needed to know more about the family she had unknowingly entrusted her child to. Through the online true crime community, she managed to connect with Carl Koppelman, the web sleuth who had made the potential identification in the first place. Carl, understanding what Kathy was going through, helped point her towards sources of information. He suggested she reach out to a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly, who was familiar with the Bowman family and might be able to provide some context. Kathy reached out to O'Reilly, hoping he would tell her that Andrea had been raised in a loving home, that her decision to give up her baby had resulted in exactly the kind of stable, happy childhood she had wanted for her daughter. But Detective O'Reilly did not offer that reassurance at all. Instead, he pointed Kathy directly toward the deeply disturbing history of Dennis Bowman. Based on O'Reilly's information, Kathy filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain official records. When the documents finally arrived at her home, she sat down and began reading through page after page of police reports, court transcripts, and incident files. And with each page she turned, the image of the devoted, church-going adoptive father was completely dismantled. What emerged instead was the portrait of a predator. The documents Kathy received revealed a pattern of violence that stretched back decades, long before Andrea had ever disappeared. Let me take you back to 1979. Dennis Bowman was already married to Brenda at this point. They were living in Holland, Michigan, presenting themselves as a respectable young couple. On a Sunday morning in that year, a 27-year-old woman was attacked in her own home by an intruder. She was bound and assaulted in a truly terrifying ordeal. The police created a sketch based on her description of her attacker, a man with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Years later, Dennis Bowman confessed that he was that man in the sketch. He admitted to being the person who had committed that terrible crime against a complete stranger. But that was just the beginning of what Kathy learned. The file from May of 1980 contained an incident that was even more chilling in its calculated cruelty. A 19-year-old woman was riding her bicycle on a rural road just north of Holland. It was daytime. She probably felt reasonably safe on this quiet country road. Then a motorcyclist came up behind her and deliberately forced her off the road. The man got off his motorcycle and commanded the young woman to abandon her bike and walk with him into the woods. The young woman, operating on pure survival instinct, refused to move. She just stood there, frozen. That's when the man pulled out a weapon. He fired a shot that deliberately missed her, whistling past her head. He repeated his command, "Walk into the woods." The young woman still didn't move. Think about the courage that must have taken. Think about standing your ground when someone has just fired a weapon near you and is ordering you to go somewhere isolated where no one could hear you scream. The man fired again, this time at the ground near her feet. He made a direct threat about what would happen if she didn't comply. Just then, by pure chance, a car came driving down that rural road. The motorcyclist's head turned toward the sound of the approaching vehicle, and in that split second of distraction, the young woman made her move. She jumped back on her bicycle and pedaled away as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't look back. She just pedaled and pedaled, expecting at any moment to hear another shot or to feel the impact of being hit. But the man didn't shoot again. He didn't give chase. Maybe the approaching car made him realize it was too risky. Maybe he panicked. Whatever the reason, the young woman was able to get away. She flagged down someone in a pickup truck who drove her straight home to her parents. Her parents immediately called the police. The young woman provided a detailed description that she would never forget. A white male with tinted glasses and a distinctive blue helmet. His motorcycle had a black top case mounted on the back. By the end of that same day, police had identified and detained a suspect. They brought him in for the young woman to look at. She took one look at him and confirmed immediately, without any hesitation, that this was absolutely the man who had tried to force her into the woods. It was Dennis Bowman. And at that point, he was already a husband and the adoptive father of Andrea, who was then about 6 years old. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal conduct. He was sentenced to serve between 5 and 10 years in prison. During the sentencing process, he was referred for psychological counseling. A judge reviewed all the evidence and made an official determination that Dennis would likely pose a continuing danger to women if he were released back into society. Think about that. A judge looked at this man and said, "This person is dangerous. This person will likely hurt women again if given the opportunity." Despite this official assessment by the court, despite the psychological evaluation, despite everything that was in his file, Dennis Bowman served only the minimum sentence of 5 years. Then he was released back into the community, back to his wife and daughter, as if those 5 years in prison had somehow cured him of his violent impulses. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. Dennis Bowman's predatory behavior didn't end when he was released from prison in the mid-1980s. It didn't end after Andrea disappeared in 1989. The pattern continued, which tells you something important about who Dennis Bowman really was at his core. Let me take you to 1998, 9 years after Andrea vanished. By this point, Dennis and Brenda had moved from Holland to the nearby community of Dorr, Michigan. They were living in Salem Township, presenting themselves once again as a respectable family, active in their Catholic church, raising their younger daughter, Vanessa. A state trooper in Dorr responded to an alarm at a mobile home belonging to a 28-year-old woman named Vicky Vandenbrink. Now, Vicky had been experiencing such persistent problems with break-ins at her home that the sheriff's department had actually installed a security system for her. That's how serious and frequent these incidents had become. When the trooper arrived at the scene in response to the alarm, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from the back door of Vicky's trailer, just casually walking away, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. The trooper stopped him and asked what he was doing there. Dennis, thinking quickly, told the officer that he was temporarily staying with Vicky, who he claimed was a former co-worker of his. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. The officer, having no immediate reason to disbelieve him, allowed Dennis to leave the scene. But the trooper, doing his due diligence, contacted Vicky to verify the story. She wasn't home at the time, but when she answered her phone and heard what Dennis had told the police, she immediately said that was absolutely false. She was not hosting Dennis. He had no permission to be at her home. He was lying. The police brought Dennis back in for questioning. Confronted with Vicky's denial of his story, Dennis quickly changed his explanation. He now claimed that he had only entered her trailer because he desperately needed to use the bathroom. He couldn't wait. It was an emergency. He fabricated a story about having visited the trailer before, claiming that his daughter Vanessa had wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vicky, so he knew where she lived and thought she wouldn't mind. By this point, the police were highly skeptical of anything coming out of Dennis's mouth. They obtained permission from the court to search Dennis's property to see what else they might find. During the search of Dennis's property, investigators discovered something deeply disturbing hidden in the loft of an outbuilding. There was a black duffel bag tucked away where Dennis clearly thought no one would find it. Inside that bag, police found stolen items belonging to Vicky, including intimate personal items like underwear. But that wasn't all. The bag also contained a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. This was clearly a kit assembled by someone planning to commit crimes. Dennis was arrested on the spot, and once in custody, facing overwhelming evidence, he began to confess to behavior that was absolutely chilling. He admitted that he had become obsessed with Vicky Vandenbrink. He confessed to stalking her over a period of time, learning her routines, watching her movements. He admitted to breaking into her trailer repeatedly to steal intimate personal items, particularly underwear, which he kept like trophies. And then Dennis admitted something that really shows you the level of his predatory behavior. He confessed that he had cut a slit in Vicky's curtains, deliberately creating a viewing port so that he could peek into her home whenever he wanted and watch her without her knowledge. He could stand outside her window and observe her in what she thought was the privacy and safety of her own home. Dennis was charged with breaking and entering with intent to commit a crime. Before his sentencing hearing, which ultimately resulted in 1 year in jail and 5 years of probation, Dennis wrote a letter to the judge. In this letter, he portrayed himself as a good man who had made a mistake. He described himself as a devoted father of 2 daughters. He specifically mentioned that his daughters were 25 and 11 years old at the time of his sentencing. Here's what makes that letter so disturbing. One of those daughters he was citing, the 25-year-old daughter he was using to demonstrate what a devoted family man he was, had been missing and unseen by anyone outside the family for 10 years. Andrea would have been 25 years old in 1998, but Andrea was gone. She had vanished in 1989. Was Dennis so delusional that he still counted Andrea as one of his daughters? Or was he deliberately invoking her to manipulate the judge, knowing that claiming to have 2 daughters made him seem more sympathetic than admitting he only had one? Dennis also managed to secure character references from his Catholic church and numerous friends in the community. These people wrote letters vouching for him as a devoted family man, a pillar of the community, someone who needed to be home for his children rather than sitting in jail. These well-meaning people had no idea who Dennis Bowman really was. They were basing their testimonials on the carefully crafted public persona he had maintained for years. Father Michael O'Connell, a priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Allegan County, where Dennis frequently volunteered his time, wrote a particularly detailed letter to the district attorney. In this letter, Father O'Connell praised Dennis's character in glowing terms. He described Dennis's contributions to charity drives, his dedication to the church community, his willingness to help with whatever needed to be done. The priest argued in all sincerity that sending such a dedicated community member to prison would be a grave disservice to the church and to the wider community. He believed Dennis was essentially a good man who had made a mistake and deserved another chance. Father O'Connell had no way of knowing that this devoted volunteer had a documented history of violence against women. He had no idea about the attempted attack on the cyclist. He didn't know about the assault in 1979, and he certainly didn't know what had really happened to Andrea. This is how predators operate in plain sight. They create a public image that is so compelling, so convincing, that people simply cannot reconcile that image with the reality of their crimes. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail that Detective Pat O'Reilly uncovered was buried in a file from November of 1988. This was just 4 months before Andrea disappeared. 4 months. In November of 1988, 14-year-old Andrea confided in a teacher at her school. She told this teacher that she was afraid to go home. She revealed that her father was abusing her. She was reaching out for help in the way that so many children do, hoping that a trusted adult would intervene and protect her. The school did exactly what they were supposed to do according to their protocols. They promptly sent a social worker to the Bowman residence to investigate this very serious allegation of abuse. But when the social worker arrived and confronted Dennis and Brenda with Andrea's claim, both parents vehemently denied it. They had a ready explanation that the social worker apparently found convincing. Dennis and Brenda told the social worker that Andrea was simply acting out. They explained that Andrea had recently learned she was adopted, and she was very upset and angry about this discovery. They portrayed her accusation as an act of rebellion from an angry teenager who was lashing out at her adoptive parents. The social worker accepted this explanation. Without conducting any further investigation, without following up with Andrea privately, without checking for any physical evidence, the social worker viewed the allegation as nothing more than teenage drama. Andrea was allowed to remain in the home. The police logged the report in their system, but conducted no investigation whatsoever. No one checked back with Andrea to see how she was doing. No one monitored the situation. No one followed up. 4 months later, Andrea was gone. Can you imagine how different this story might have been if that social worker had dug a little deeper? If someone had taken Andrea's cry for help seriously? If the police had actually investigated instead of just filing a report and moving on? This is one of those moments in a case where you can see the exact point where intervention could have changed everything. And it didn't happen. After learning about Dennis Bowman's extensive criminal history, after reading report after report about his violence, his stalking, his assaults, Kathy's entire understanding of what had happened to her daughter completely shifted. The runaway theory that had satisfied investigators for 2 decades suddenly made absolutely no sense. If Dennis was capable of all these documented acts of violence and predatory behavior, why would anyone believe that Andrea had simply packed a bag and left voluntarily? Kathy began to seriously reconsider the theory that Andrea was the Racine County Jane Doe. Think about what that theory required. It required believing that Andrea had somehow survived her disappearance, lived somewhere for 10 full years from age 14 to age 25, and then ended up dead in a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999. It was possible, certainly. Teenagers do run away. Some of them do survive for years living on the streets or in bad situations. But given what Kathy now knew about Dennis, she began to fear something much darker. She began to fear that her daughter had never made it out of Ottawa County at all, that Andrea had never left Michigan alive. Kathy became intensely focused on the Bowmans' current residence in Salem Township on 134th Avenue. This was the property the family had moved to shortly after Andrea's disappearance, and it had been their home for over 2 decades now. Kathy spent hours on her computer, obsessively analyzing satellite imagery of the property using Google Earth. She would zoom in as far as the technology would allow, studying every detail of the backyard, looking for anything that seemed unusual or disturbed. And she found something. There was a specific patch of earth in the backyard that looked different from the surrounding area. It appeared to have been disturbed at some point. The grass grew differently there. Something about it just looked wrong to Kathy's eyes. She became absolutely convinced that her daughter was buried in that spot. She could feel it. It was a mother's intuition, perhaps, but it was overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Kathy contacted investigators repeatedly, pleading with them to search the property. She sent them the satellite images with the suspicious area circled. She explained her reasoning. She begged them to at least check, to bring cadaver dogs, to do something. But the system required more than a mother's intuition, no matter how strong. The police explained that they needed probable cause for a search warrant. They needed evidence, not suspicion. They couldn't just dig up someone's property because a satellite image looked slightly unusual. Carl Koppelman, who had remained involved in the case, actually disagreed with Kathy's theory about the burial location. Carl had studied criminal behavior patterns, and he argued from a profiling perspective that offenders rarely take the enormous risk of digging up remains and relocating them to a new home. Think about the logistics of that. You would have to return to the original burial site, possibly years later. You would have to dig up decomposed remains, which would be a horrific task. You would have to transport those remains to a new location without being seen. You would have to dig a new grave and rebury everything. Every single step of that process would be a risk of being caught. Carl believed it was far more likely that Andrea was buried somewhere near the old farmhouse on Lincoln Road, where the family had been living when she disappeared. The police, citing a complete lack of physical evidence and probable cause, continued to reject Kathy's requests for a search warrant. And here's perhaps the cruelest aspect of Kathy's situation. Because of the closed adoption that had occurred decades earlier, the law no longer recognized Kathy as Andrea's mother in any legal sense. Andrea's legal parents were Dennis and Brenda Bowman. Kathy had no standing, no rights, no legal authority to demand anything regarding Andrea's case. She was completely powerless despite being Andrea's biological mother, despite having given birth to her, despite having spent 3 decades wondering what had happened to the baby she gave up for adoption. In 2013, after years of waiting, the DNA results finally came back from the laboratory. Kathy was not biologically related to the Racine County Jane Doe. The young woman found in that Wisconsin cornfield was someone else's daughter, not Kathy's. The result was devastating in one sense. For years, there had been at least the possibility that Andrea had survived her disappearance and had lived for a decade before dying in Wisconsin. It wasn't the outcome anyone wanted, but it left open the possibility that Andrea had experienced 10 years of life after leaving the Bowman home. Now that possibility was gone. If Andrea wasn't the Jane Doe from 1999, then where had she been for the past 24 years? Was she still alive somewhere? Or had something happened to her much sooner than anyone had hoped? For Kathy, the DNA results actually strengthened her conviction that Dennis was directly responsible for whatever had happened to Andrea. If Andrea hadn't survived to age 25, if she wasn't the Wisconsin Jane Doe, then the most likely scenario was that she had never left Ottawa County at all. Kathy's suspicion about that disturbed patch of earth in the Bowman's backyard intensified. She knew in her bones that her daughter was there. In September of 2013, Kathy and Carl Koppelman met in person for the first time at an event called the Missing in Michigan Conference. This was a gathering specifically designed to generate new leads and public awareness for cold cases throughout the state. Kathy and Carl had prepared for this event. They wore custom-made shirts that featured Andrea's photograph and read in bold letters, "Find Andrea Bowman." They wanted everyone at that conference to see Andrea's face, to remember her case, to keep her story alive. As Carl scanned the crowded conference room, looking at all the families and investigators gathered there, he suddenly spotted 2 faces that made him stop in his tracks. He leaned close to Kathy and said quietly, "That's Vanessa, the red-haired woman over there. That's Andrea's younger sister, and the woman standing next to her, that's Brenda Bowman." Kathy's heart must have been pounding. She was standing in the same room as the woman who had raised her daughter, the woman who had renamed her Alexis to Andrea, the woman who was married to the man Kathy believed had harmed her child. Brenda recognized Kathy as well. She had seen Kathy's posts on social media. She knew that Kathy believed Dennis was responsible for Andrea's disappearance. And instead of avoiding a confrontation, instead of staying on the other side of the room, Brenda walked directly over to them. Brenda seemed almost eager to defend her husband. She wanted to set the record straight, to counter what she viewed as false accusations. She insisted that she and Dennis had cooperated fully with the authorities back in 1989, when Andrea first disappeared. As proof of their cooperation and their innocence, Brenda produced a thick binder that she had brought with her to the conference. It was filled with notes, copies of flyers they had made, records of tips they had followed up on, documentation of their search efforts. "Look at all this," Brenda seemed to be saying. "Look at how much we did to try to find Andrea. How can you possibly believe Dennis had anything to do with her disappearance when we worked so hard to find her?" Carl, speaking gently but firmly, pressed Brenda about Dennis's documented criminal history. He mentioned the convictions, the assaults, the stalking, the pattern of violent behavior toward women. Brenda's response to this was absolutely chilling in its unwavering loyalty. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is close to her exact words, "I haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously, for better or for worse. That's what I promised." Think about what that means. Brenda was acknowledging that yes, Dennis had committed these crimes. Yes, he had assaulted women. Yes, he had stalked and terrorized people. But she had forgiven him for all of it because she believed her marriage vows required her to stand by him no matter what. This is the dynamic that allowed Dennis Bowman to operate for decades. He had a wife who refused to question him, who stood as an impenetrable barrier between him and accountability, who would defend him against any accusation no matter how compelling the evidence. With Brenda maintaining this position, the investigation in Michigan remained completely stalled. Dennis Bowman continued to be a free man, living his life in Salem Township, protected by his wife's forgiveness and the lack of physical evidence that would allow police to charge him. But the breakthrough this case desperately needed wasn't going to come from Michigan at all. It was waiting 700 miles away in Virginia, in a cold case file that was about to be reopened using cutting-edge technology that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. The case that would ultimately break everything wide open belonged to a young woman named Kathleen O'Brien Doyle. Let me take you back to 1980, to Norfolk, Virginia. Kathleen was 25 years old, recently married to a Navy pilot named Stephen Doyle. They had been married for only 5 months, still in that honeymoon phase where everything feels new and exciting. Then duty called, as it so often does for military families. Stephen was deployed aboard the USS Eisenhower, one of the Navy's aircraft carriers. He would be gone for months, leaving Kathleen alone in their small home with just her orange tabby cat for company. As a serviceman's wife, Kathleen was accustomed to these periods of solitude. Military spouses learn to be independent, to handle things on their own, to create routines that help pass the time until their loved ones return. But by September of 1980, that solitude turned into something far more sinister. Kathleen's friends began to realize they hadn't seen her in quite a while. Phone calls went unanswered. She didn't show up for plans they had made. Days passed without anyone hearing from her, which was unusual because Kathleen was normally very reliable about staying in touch. Growing increasingly concerned, friends went to her house to check on her. They knocked on the door. No answer. They called out her name. Nothing. Finally, they managed to get inside. What they found when they entered that small Norfolk home was a scene of absolute horror. Kathleen was lying deceased in her bedroom. The room around her had been ransacked in what appeared to be a violent frenzy. Drawers pulled open, belongings scattered, signs of a desperate struggle. Kathleen's body showed evidence of restraints. She had been bound and gagged. The condition of the scene was so disturbing that even experienced first responders were shaken by what they saw. The medical examiner's report revealed the truly sadistic nature of whoever had done this to Kathleen. She had been strangled with a rope. She had been stabbed multiple times all over her body in what appeared to be a frenzied attack, and she had been sexually assaulted in a brutal manner. The medical examiner determined that Kathleen had died sometime between 7:30 in the evening and midnight. But her body hadn't been discovered until noon on September 11th, which meant she had lain there undiscovered for at least 12 hours and possibly much longer. The investigation was intensive at first. Norfolk police worked the case hard, interviewing neighbors, checking for witnesses, processing the crime scene for every possible piece of evidence. But despite their best efforts, they had very little to work with. There were no witnesses who had seen anyone entering or leaving the home. There were no obvious suspects. The crime appeared to be random, which made it nearly impossible to solve using traditional investigative methods. The case went cold. Kathleen's husband, Stephen, eventually returned from deployment to bury his wife and try to make sense of a tragedy that made no sense at all. The case stayed cold until 1984 when something unexpected happened. Investigators received what they believed might be a major breakthrough from an unlikely source, a death row cell in Texas. A man named Henry Lee Lucas had become infamous as a serial confessor. He was already on death row for murdering his own mother, and he had begun providing investigators with long lists of other people he claimed to have killed across the country. Lucas was confessing to hundreds of murders. Some of these confessions were clearly false, but some contained details that only the killer would know. Investigators from multiple states were flying to Texas to interview him about cold cases. Among the hundreds of names Lucas provided was Kathleen Doyle. The Norfolk Police Department took this lead seriously enough to fly investigators all the way to Texas to interview Lucas in person. And I have to say, Lucas was convincing when he wanted to be. He provided details about the crime scene that seemed to match the actual evidence. He claimed that he and his accomplice, a man named Otis Toole, had been in Norfolk at the time and had committed the murder. Norfolk investigators were ready to charge both Lucas and Toole with Kathleen's murder. They believed they had finally solved this terrible case after 4 years. But then, just as suddenly as he had confessed, Henry Lee Lucas recanted everything. He admitted, almost gleefully, that he had made the whole thing up. He told investigators that he had been lying about dozens or possibly hundreds of the murders he had confessed to. He did it, he said, because he wanted to make law enforcement look foolish. He enjoyed the attention, the trips out of his cell, the special treatment he received when he was being interviewed about all these cases. The confession collapsed completely. Lucas's credibility was destroyed. And with it went the hope for justice in Kathleen Doyle's case. The one thing investigators did have from the crime scene was biological evidence. DNA had been collected from the bedding in Kathleen's room. But this was 1980. DNA profiling technology was still in its infancy. The science that would eventually revolutionize criminal investigations barely existed yet. The evidence was carefully preserved and stored, waiting for a future where technology might be able to use it. And then the case went cold again. The silence lasted for nearly 4 decades. It wasn't until 2018, 38 years after Kathleen's murder, that the Norfolk Cold Case Unit decided to try a revolutionary new approach that was beginning to transform how old crimes got solved. The method was called genetic genealogy, and if you've been following true crime news in recent years, you've probably heard about it. This is the same technique that was used to identify the Golden State Killer, to solve decades-old murders, to identify unknown remains. Here's how it works. Investigators take DNA from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases that millions of people use to learn about their ancestry or find distant relatives. The database searches for genetic matches, and what comes back isn't usually a direct match to the perpetrator. Instead, you get matches to distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share some DNA with the person you're looking for. Then genetic genealogists build family trees, working backward and forward through generations, narrowing down the possibilities until they identify potential suspects. Detective Jonathan Smith from the Norfolk Cold Case Unit decided to try this approach with the DNA profile that had been preserved on the bedsheet from Kathleen's home all those years ago. The sample was submitted to a genealogy company for analysis. After approximately 1 year of painstaking genetic genealogy work, Detective Smith received results. The analysis had produced a list of 32 names. These weren't direct matches to the DNA from the crime scene. These were distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic markers to indicate they were part of the same extended family tree as whoever had left that DNA in Kathleen's bedroom. The genealogists had constructed a family tree based on these 32 people, working out how they were all related to each other, identifying common ancestors, narrowing down the branches. And at the center of that carefully constructed web was a single name: Dennis Lee Bowman. Detective Smith had never heard of Dennis Bowman before. The name meant nothing to him initially, but he immediately began running background checks and searching for information about this person. What he discovered alarmed him tremendously. He learned that Dennis Bowman had an extensive criminal history in Michigan involving violence against women. Internet searches revealed that in May of 1980, just a few months before Kathleen's murder, Bowman had been arrested for the attempted abduction and assault of a young woman on a bicycle in Holland, Michigan. Detective Smith also discovered something else that caught his attention. He learned that Dennis Bowman's adopted daughter, Andrea, had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in 1989 and had never been found. Her case was still technically open as a missing person investigation. All of these connections raised red flags for Detective Smith, but he needed to verify something crucial. Had Dennis Bowman even been in Norfolk, Virginia in September of 1980 when Kathleen was murdered? Smith attended a cold case conference with law enforcement departments from across the country. At this conference, he located a detective sergeant from the Michigan State Police. He approached him and asked directly, "Do you know anything about a man named Dennis Bowman?" The sergeant's response was immediate and unambiguous. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "I'll tell you right now, John, I know Dennis and I know his family. If you're looking at him for a murder, he's probably your guy." That was quite an endorsement, if you can call it that, from someone who was familiar with Bowman and his history. Detective Smith worked with local police departments in Michigan to pull old court records and military service documents, and he found exactly what he was looking for. A court transcript from September of 1980 confirmed beyond any doubt that Dennis Bowman had been in Norfolk on a 2-week military drill during the exact time window when Kathleen Doyle was murdered. Dennis was a Navy reservist at that time. His unit had been called up for training exercises, and those exercises took place at a Navy base in Norfolk. Dennis had been required to be there. His presence was documented in official military records. The timeline matched perfectly. The location matched perfectly, and the DNA linked him to the crime scene. Detective Smith now had a solid suspect after nearly 40 years. Realizing they finally had a viable suspect, Detective Smith contacted the Allegan County Sheriff's Office in Michigan. They needed to obtain a DNA sample from Dennis Bowman to compare it against the preserved evidence from Kathleen's murder. But this had to be done carefully, without alerting Dennis to the fact that he was under investigation. The plan was to establish surveillance on Dennis and wait for an opportunity to collect what's called abandoned DNA. Maybe he would throw away a coffee cup. Maybe he would discard a water bottle. Maybe he would spit out chewing gum. Anything that contained his saliva or skin cells would work. Investigators in Michigan began formulating this surveillance plan, coordinating with Virginia authorities, preparing to tail Dennis Bowman wherever he went until they got their sample. But then, something unexpected happened that made the surveillance completely unnecessary. Dennis and Brenda Bowman walked into the Allegan County Sheriff's Office entirely on their own initiative. They were there to file a formal complaint against Kathy Turkanian. They claimed that Kathy had been harassing them online, posting accusations on social media about Dennis being responsible for Andrea's disappearance. They wanted something done about it. They wanted her stopped. The investigators who met with them must have barely been able to believe their luck. Here was their suspect, walking right through the front door, voluntarily entering a police station. They invited Dennis and Brenda into an interview room, ostensibly to take their complaint. They acted sympathetic to their concerns about online harassment. And during this conversation, as a simple courtesy, they offered Dennis a bottle of water. Dennis accepted the bottle without hesitation. He drank from it freely while he talked about how Kathy was ruining his reputation online, how unfair it was that she was making these accusations, how she needed to stop spreading lies about him. He had no idea that the bottle he was drinking from was about to seal his fate. When Dennis and Brenda eventually finished making their complaint and left the sheriff's office, the investigators immediately secured that water bottle. It was carefully packaged as evidence, maintaining the chain of custody, and sent directly to a forensic laboratory for DNA analysis. Then came the waiting. Forensic testing takes time, especially when you're doing the kind of detailed analysis required for a decades-old murder case. Days turned into weeks. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity to Detective Smith and the other investigators who had worked so hard on this case, the results came back from the laboratory. The DNA from Dennis Bowman's water bottle was a definitive, unquestionable match to the biological evidence recovered from Kathleen Doyle's bedsheet 39 years earlier. They had him. In November of 2019, Norfolk police flew to Michigan to apprehend Dennis Bowman. He was now 70 years old, an elderly man who had been living freely for nearly 4 decades after committing a brutal murder. The arrest took place at Dennis and Brenda's home in Salem Township. Multiple officers were present, because they weren't entirely sure how Dennis would react when he realized he was being arrested for a murder committed before many of the officers had even been born. Dennis and Brenda were home when police arrived. Officers knocked on the door and identified themselves. Brenda answered, and you can imagine the confusion on her face when she saw multiple police officers standing on her doorstep. They explained that they had a warrant for Dennis's arrest in connection with a murder in Virginia in 1980. Brenda's reaction was immediate and emphatic denial. She refused to believe it. She insisted it was impossible because, in her mind, Dennis had not been in Virginia in 1980. Despite the fact that military records proved otherwise, Brenda simply could not or would not accept that this was real. As officers entered the home and began to place Dennis under arrest, reading him his rights and preparing to handcuff him, Brenda's panic escalated. She shouted at the officers, "You've got the wrong person! He would never do something like that!" She tried to physically position herself between the officers and her husband, as if her body could somehow prevent what was happening. In 1980, he barely even left Michigan, she insisted, even though this was directly contradicted by Dennis's own military service records showing his presence at a Norfolk base for 2 weeks in September of that year. An officer gently tried to move Brenda aside so they could proceed with the arrest. But Brenda slapped his hand away. "Stop! Let him go!" she cried out. "You don't understand. Dennis is a good man. He helps at the church. He volunteers his time. He didn't kill anyone." Throughout this entire scene, Dennis himself reportedly remained relatively calm and quiet, allowing his wife to defend him while he accepted the inevitable. After the situation in the living room was brought under control, officers carefully escorted Dennis out of the house toward the waiting patrol vehicles. Brenda followed them to the door, her voice breaking into sobs. "Dennis, I believe you," she called after him. "I'll find the best lawyer I can. We're going to prove you're innocent. This is all a mistake." Dennis was immediately transported to the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, where he would be held while awaiting extradition proceedings to send him back to Virginia to face charges. The moment Dennis Bowman arrived at the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, Detective Jonathan Smith, who had flown up from Virginia specifically for this, entered the interrogation room. Smith had a strategy for this interrogation. He wasn't going to come in aggressively, pounding the table, screaming accusations. He was going to try a more psychological approach. Smith deliberately removed his badge and set it aside. This was a calculated move to lower the immediate tension in the room, to make the interrogation feel less like an adversarial confrontation and more like a conversation between two people. The approach worked remarkably well. Dennis, who might have shut down completely if faced with an aggressive interrogator, gradually began to open up to Smith. They started by talking about Dennis's childhood. Dennis spoke about his parents, describing a difficult relationship with them. He talked about feeling misunderstood as a child, about conflicts and disappointments that had shaped him. Smith listened patiently, building rapport, letting Dennis talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. Dennis shared his long-standing fascination with knives and other bladed weapons, which he described as collecting, though the way he talked about them suggested something deeper and more troubling. As the conversation continued and trust slowly built between them, as Dennis became more comfortable in this strange situation, he eventually felt at ease enough to begin discussing the Kathleen Doyle case. Dennis admitted that he had indeed been in Norfolk for military training in September of 1980. He acknowledged that the deployment had lasted approximately 1 week to 10 days. He described feeling stressed during this time, isolated from everyone he knew, separated from his wife and young daughter back home in Michigan. According to Dennis's account, he decided one evening to leave the Navy base to clear his head. He claimed he went to a bar somewhere in Norfolk and became heavily intoxicated. He said he drank far more than he should have, that he lost track of how much alcohol he had consumed. Dennis described wandering the streets of Norfolk afterward, disoriented and drunk, not really knowing where he was going. He said he eventually spotted a house that appeared to be empty. The lights were all off. There was no car in the driveway. To Dennis's alcohol-impaired reasoning, this seemed like an opportunity. He claimed he decided to break into the house to search for money. That was his stated motivation: simple theft. He needed cash for some reason, and this house looked like an easy target. Dennis recounted entering the home and searching through rooms, looking for cash or valuables he could take. Then, according to his story, he opened a bedroom door and suddenly encountered Kathleen, who must have been sleeping or resting in the darkened room. She began to scream in fear. Dennis claimed that he instinctively covered her mouth with his left hand to stop the screaming. With his right hand, which happened to be holding a pocket knife, he pushed her. According to Dennis, when Kathleen fell or stumbled, she grabbed at his hand, and somehow in the confusion, the knife accidentally penetrated her body. Dennis insisted that he left the house immediately after this, while Kathleen was still wounded but moving on the bed. He claimed he even told her he was leaving, as if that somehow made what he had done less terrible. Now, here's the thing you need to understand. Dennis's confession was a carefully sanitized version of events that bore almost no resemblance to what the forensic evidence showed had actually happened. Dennis mentioned nothing about strangulation, even though Kathleen had been strangled with a rope. He said nothing about the burn mark that had been found on Kathleen's face. He completely omitted any mention of the sexual assault, which was one of the most brutal aspects of the crime, according to the medical examiner's report. When Detective Smith asked Dennis what he had felt during the attack, what was going through his mind, Dennis refused to take any real responsibility for his actions. Instead, he blamed what he described as a demon that had taken control of him. He said it wasn't really him committing these acts. It was this entity, this presence, this thing that possessed him and made him do terrible things. As Dennis talked about this supposed demon, his entire demeanor shifted noticeably. Detective Smith later noted that Dennis appeared almost to be in a different state of consciousness, as if he were channeling something or acting out a role. Dennis even took a notepad and pen and drew a picture of this entity he was describing. The drawing showed a creature with horns and a pointed beard, a classic demonic figure. Dennis claimed this thing wanted to get out of him, that it controlled him during certain moments. When Detective Smith confronted Dennis with the actual physical evidence from the crime scene, when he detailed the multiple stab wounds all over Kathleen's body, the defensive wounds, on her hands where she had tried to protect herself, the ligature marks on her wrists and neck showing she had been bound and strangled, the extensive bruising indicating a prolonged and violent assault, Dennis shut down completely. He claimed he couldn't remember any of that. He stuck rigidly to his story of a single accidental knife wound. He refused to elaborate. He wouldn't make eye contact. His behavior regressed to what Smith described as an almost childlike state, as if he were trying to make himself smaller and disappear. At one point, Detective Smith left the interrogation room, leaving Dennis alone. The cameras in the room continued recording, which is standard procedure. What those cameras captured was absolutely chilling. Dennis sat there by himself, muttering quietly. At first, the audio picked up him whispering to himself, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." Over and over, like a mantra, like he was trying to convince himself. But then, abruptly, the words changed. "I did it again," Dennis whispered. "I did it again. I did it again." That statement, captured on camera, was damning. I did it again. Not I did it, but I did it again, suggesting that there had been a first time and a second time, and possibly more times that no one knew about yet. Dennis Bowman was now confirmed as the person who had murdered Kathleen Doyle in 1980. Justice for Kathleen was finally within reach after 39 years, but there was still the matter of Andrea. What had happened to Dennis's adopted daughter who had disappeared in 1989? Her case remained unsolved, her remains unfound, her fate unknown. Investigators understood that the leverage they now held over Dennis was their only realistic opportunity to find out what had happened to Andrea and finally bring some closure to that case. With Dennis in custody facing life imprisonment for Kathleen's murder, the timeline for solving Andrea's disappearance became urgent. Once Dennis was formally extradited to Virginia to begin serving his sentence, the opportunity to make a deal with him would essentially disappear forever. Michigan investigators officially named Dennis as the prime suspect in Andrea's disappearance. They conducted a thorough physical search of his property on 134th Avenue using specially trained cadaver dogs. These dogs are trained to detect the scent of human remains, even remains that have been buried for decades. But the search yielded nothing. The dogs didn't alert to any specific location. Either Andrea wasn't buried there, or she was buried so deep or so well concealed that even the dogs couldn't detect her. The earth was keeping its secrets, and Brenda remained an impenetrable wall of loyalty, steadfastly defending her husband, refusing to believe he could have harmed Andrea, maintaining that Andrea had run away, just as Dennis had always claimed. To break this deadlock, police proposed a grim but necessary deal to Dennis. They understood him well enough by this point to know that his priority wasn't his conscience or doing the right thing. His priority was maintaining some connection to his family, particularly to Brenda and his biological daughter Vanessa. The deal was straightforward but stark. If Dennis revealed the location of Andrea's remains, he would be allowed to serve his time in a Michigan prison facility. This would mean that Brenda and Vanessa could visit him regularly. They could maintain their relationship. He wouldn't be completely cut off from them. But if he refused to cooperate, if he chose to keep Andrea's location a secret, he would be immediately extradited to Virginia. He would serve his life sentence there, more than 700 miles away from his family. Brenda and Vanessa would rarely, if ever, be able to visit. He would die in prison without ever seeing them again. For Dennis, this was a calculation. His freedom was already gone. That was decided. But he could choose whether to spend his remaining years in relative proximity to his family or in complete isolation. Initially, Dennis was reluctant to make any kind of confession about Andrea. He had maintained the runaway story for 30 years. Admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that he had lied to police, to the community, to his own wife for 3 decades. But eventually, faced with the prospect of permanent separation from his family, Dennis agreed to talk. However, he had one condition. He insisted on a supervised meeting with Brenda before he would tell investigators anything. Before Brenda arrived for this meeting, Dennis did something revealing. He specifically checked to ensure that the interrogation room cameras were recording. He wanted this conversation documented. This was going to be a performance for posterity, a carefully crafted version of events designed to manipulate how he would be remembered. When Brenda entered the interrogation room and saw Dennis sitting there in handcuffs and prison clothing, the emotion on her face must have been overwhelming. This was the man she had been married to for over 4 decades. The father of her child, her partner through all of life's ups and downs. And now he was going to tell her something that would shatter whatever remained of the life they had built together. Dennis finally confessed to Brenda that Andrea had been deceased since the day she disappeared in March of 1989. Andrea had never run away. She had never lived on the streets. She had never searched for her birth mother. She had never existed beyond that night 30 years ago. But the story Dennis told Brenda was a carefully constructed narrative designed to minimize his guilt and shift blame away from himself. It was a masterclass in manipulation. According to Dennis's account, he had arrived home that evening with baby Vanessa to find Andrea upstairs packing a bag. When he confronted her and asked where she thought she was going, Andrea allegedly threatened him. Dennis claimed that Andrea said she was going to tell her therapists again that he had been inappropriate with her, that he had been abusing her. Remember, Andrea had made exactly this report to a teacher just 4 months earlier, in November of 1988. Dennis told Brenda that they argued. He admitted that he struck Andrea in anger, and according to his version of events, Andrea fell backward down the stairs as a result of being hit. Dennis claimed that when he approached to check on her condition, he noticed that her head was tilted to one side in an unnatural position. Her eyes were still open, but she wasn't responding. When he checked for a pulse, he couldn't find one. So according to Dennis, Andrea's death was essentially an accident. He hit her, she fell, the fall killed her. He was just a panicked father who overreacted to a teenager's threat. Dennis told Brenda that he made a split-second decision in that moment of panic. He claimed he didn't want to lose Brenda by going to prison for what he characterized as an accident. So instead of calling for help, instead of reporting what had happened, he decided to cover it up. He said he wrapped Andrea's body in a blanket and carried it out to the barn behind the house. He hid her there temporarily while he figured out what to do. Then he went back inside and called the police to report Andrea as a runaway, pointing to the missing suitcase and money as evidence. Regarding what happened to the body after that initial concealment, Dennis offered what seemed like a convenient explanation. He told Brenda that he had later moved Andrea's body into a large cardboard barrel. Then, days after her death, he claimed he placed this barrel containing his daughter's remains with the neighbor's trash for pickup. According to this story, the trash collection service came as scheduled, took the barrel along with all the regular garbage, and transported everything to a landfill. Dennis said he believed Andrea's body had been incinerated at the landfill along with tons of other waste, leaving no remains to ever be found. It was a neat story. It explained why no body had ever been found. It portrayed Dennis as someone who had panicked and made bad decisions, rather than someone who had deliberately harmed his daughter. And it suggested that there was no body to recover, no crime scene to excavate, no physical evidence that could contradict his version of events. Brenda sat there listening to this confession, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter had been dead for 30 years. All those nights she had spent driving country roads searching for Andrea, all those tips she had followed up on, all those years of hoping Andrea would come home someday, it had all been based on a lie. And yet, despite everything, despite learning that her husband had killed their daughter and had lied to her for 3 decades, Brenda's response was stunning. She told Dennis that she forgave him. She said she still loved him. She was standing by her man, even now, even after this. Investigators, along with Andrea's birth mother Kathy, were immediately skeptical of Dennis's confession to Brenda. The story felt too convenient, too calculated. It blamed Andrea for provoking her own death by threatening to report abuse. It portrayed Dennis as a panicked father rather than a killer, and the trash pickup explanation seemed highly improbable. Think about the logistics of what Dennis was claiming. He would have had to transport a body into a cardboard barrel, which would have been heavy and awkward. Then he would have had to place this barrel with the neighbor's trash without anyone noticing. Trash collectors would have had to pick it up and transport it, without noticing that one barrel was significantly heavier than it should be. The body would have had to be incinerated without anyone at the landfill noticing human remains. Every single step of that scenario seemed unlikely for a man as calculated and careful as Dennis had proven himself to be over the years. Police made the decision to carefully monitor all of Dennis's communications going forward. Any letters he wrote, any phone calls he made, any messages he tried to send would be intercepted and reviewed, and soon, very soon, that decision paid off enormously. Investigators began intercepting letters that Dennis was writing to Brenda from jail, and the content of these letters directly contradicted the story he had just told her face-to-face in that interrogation room. In a letter dated December 12, 2019, just weeks after his confession to Brenda, Dennis wrote something completely different. He stated clearly that he had not actually put Andrea's body in the trash at all. Instead, he wrote he had placed her in what he described as a private cemetery. He didn't elaborate on what he meant by that phrase, but it was clearly not the same as claiming her body had been destroyed in a landfill. In subsequent letters, Dennis described Andrea's burial with haunting and very specific detail. He wrote about the clothes she had been wearing when she was buried, jeans, her favorite sweater, and a gold necklace. These weren't the kind of details you remember about someone whose body you supposedly put in a trash barrel 30 years ago. Most chillingly, Dennis wrote that over the past 30 years, he had walked past Andrea's burial site more than 100 times. This suggested that she was buried somewhere on property that Dennis regularly accessed, somewhere he lived or worked, somewhere he had maintained contact with for 3 decades. Armed with these clear contradictions between Dennis's confession and his private letters, investigators confronted him once again. This time, Dennis was defiant. He looked at the investigators and stated coldly that he would take the exact location of Andrea's burial to his grave. They would never find her. He had kept the secret for 30 years, and he could keep it forever. It was a power play. Even from behind bars, facing life in prison, Dennis wanted to maintain some control over the situation. Keeping Andrea's location secret was the last bit of power he had. Authorities realized they needed to apply pressure from a different angle. They turned to the only person Dennis seemed to genuinely care about maintaining a relationship with, Brenda. Investigators sat down with Brenda and explained the harsh reality of the situation in very clear terms. Without recovering Andrea's body, the deal was completely off the table. There would be no arrangement for Dennis to serve his time in Michigan. He would be immediately and permanently transferred to Virginia, more than 700 miles away. Brenda would rarely be able to visit him. The distance was too great. The cost of travel was too high. Phone calls and letters would be their only real contact. She would essentially lose him just as surely as if he had died. Under this intense pressure, and reportedly driven by a genuine desire to finally give Andrea a proper burial and cremation after all these years, Brenda pleaded desperately with Dennis to tell the truth. She visited him again. She explained that this was their last chance to do the right thing, to finally let Andrea rest properly, to give her the dignity she deserved even in death. And finally, after weeks of stonewalling, after all the lies and misdirection and manipulations, Dennis relented. He admitted that the trash story was completely false. He had never put Andrea's body in a barrel. He had never placed her with the neighbor's garbage. That entire story was fabricated. The truth was much darker. Dennis confessed that he had originally buried Andrea in the backyard of the rental home they had been living in on Lincoln Road at the time of her death in March of 1989. He had dug a grave in the darkness, placed her body in it, and covered it back up. Then he had gone inside to begin constructing the runaway narrative. But then Dennis revealed something that sent chills through everyone who heard it. When the Bowman family moved from Lincoln Road to their new home on 134th Avenue shortly after Andrea's disappearance, Dennis had done something almost unthinkable. He had returned to the old property under the cover of night. He had brought tools and worked in darkness, digging up Andrea's remains from where they had been buried for months or possibly years. He had transported those remains to the new property, and he had reburied them in the backyard of the new house where the family would be living. He had literally moved his victim with him to keep her under his control, even in death. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't leave her behind. So he brought her remains to the new location and buried her where he could walk past her grave every single day. It was a level of control and possession that went beyond anything investigators had seen before. Armed with this new information, police immediately mobilized a team and returned to the property on 134th Avenue. They brought heavy excavation equipment, forensic specialists, and cadaver dogs. Dennis had indicated a general area of the backyard where Andrea was buried. And here's where this story takes a turn that validates something Kathy had been saying for years. The exact spot that Dennis pointed to, the location where he finally admitted he had buried Andrea, was the precise patch of disturbed earth that Kathy Turkanian had identified on Google Earth years earlier. Remember, Kathy had spent hours studying satellite imagery of that property. She had noticed a section of the backyard that looked different from the surrounding area. She had become convinced that her daughter was buried there. She had pleaded with police to search that exact location. And police had dismissed her concerns as a grieving mother's desperate wishful thinking, as seeing patterns where none existed. But Kathy's maternal intuition had been absolutely correct. She had identified the grave from satellite images taken from space, and she had been right all along. The excavation team carefully began their work in that section of the backyard. They had to proceed slowly and methodically to preserve any evidence that might still exist after 30 years. As they dug deeper, they found a shallow grave that had been carefully concealed. Inside that grave was a large plastic trash bag, and inside that large bag were 4 smaller bags nested together. The contents of those bags revealed just how calculated Dennis had been in concealing what he had done. Inside the innermost bags, mixed with the remains, were used diapers, multiple used diapers that Dennis had apparently collected and deliberately placed with Andrea's body. Investigators believe he did this to mask the scent of decomposition. If anyone had brought cadaver dogs to search the property over the years, if neighbors had noticed an unusual smell, the presence of dirty diapers would have provided an innocent explanation. It was disturbing in its cleverness. Also buried with the remains was a small piece of evidence that helped confirm the timeline. A candy wrapper dated to 1989, the year Andrea disappeared. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to a forensic laboratory for analysis. Despite 3 decades in the ground, despite the decomposition and the elements, there was enough material remaining for DNA testing. The results came back with scientific certainty. The remains were positively identified as Andrea Michelle Bowman. After 30 years of searching, after 3 decades of wondering and hoping and fearing, Andrea had finally been found. She had been there the entire time, buried just feet from where her family lived their daily lives, where Dennis and Brenda ate breakfast and watched television and celebrated holidays. Dennis had walked past her grave more than 100 times, just as he had written in his letter. Every time he mowed the lawn, every time he worked in the yard, every time he looked out the back window, he knew exactly where she was. Even after the discovery of Andrea's remains, even after irrefutable DNA confirmation that Dennis had murdered her daughter and hidden her body for 3 decades, Brenda maintained her loyalty. In a recorded phone call from the jail after the excavation, Brenda told Dennis that nothing had changed between them. She said she still loved him completely. She would stand by him no matter what. It's a level of denial and codependency that's difficult for most people to comprehend. Following the discovery of Andrea's remains, it was as though a psychological dam inside Dennis had finally broken. He began admitting to other offenses that investigators had never connected to him, crimes that had gone unsolved for decades. Dennis confessed to additional attacks that had occurred in San Diego during his time stationed there with the Navy. Some of these attacks had happened before his marriage to Brenda. Others had occurred during the early years of their marriage while Dennis was still in active service. He admitted to another incident at a trailer park in the early 1980s that had never been solved. The victim in that case had reported the attack, but police had never identified a suspect. Each confession opened up old case files, brought renewed pain to victims who thought they would never see justice, and raised troubling questions about how many other crimes Dennis might have committed that no one knew about. Investigators strongly suspect that Kathleen Doyle may not have been Dennis's first murder. The level of violence in that crime, the sadistic elements, the apparent lack of remorse, these often aren't characteristics of someone committing their first serious offense, but Dennis has not admitted to any other homicides. If there are other victims out there, other families who have spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones, Dennis has chosen to keep those secrets. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. On February 7th, 2022, Dennis Bowman stood before a judge in Michigan to be sentenced for what happened to Andrea. Facing absolutely undeniable evidence, his own confession, the discovery of Andrea's remains where he said they would be, forensic confirmation of her identity, Dennis entered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder charges. A no-contest plea is legally equivalent to a guilty plea for sentencing purposes, but it means the defendant is not formally admitting guilt. It's a legal technicality that some defendants use to maintain some psychological distance from their crimes. The judge who presided over the sentencing hearing was clearly moved by the case. From the bench, he stated that in his decades of service in the judicial system, very few cases had disturbed him as profoundly as this one. A father who had murdered his own daughter, who had buried her in the backyard, who had lied about it for 30 years, who had even gone so far as to dig up her remains and move them to a new location to maintain his control over her, even in death. The judge sentenced Dennis to serve a minimum of 35 years and a maximum of 50 years in prison for Andrea's murder. But here's where the plea deal arrangement becomes important. The deal had been structured very carefully to ensure that Dennis would have absolutely no control over his ultimate fate. Yes, he would initially serve his time in Michigan, which theoretically meant Brenda and Vanessa could visit him. That was the carrot that had gotten him to reveal Andrea's location. But once his Michigan sentence was complete, or possibly even before, depending on how Virginia prosecutors wanted to handle it, Dennis would be transferred to Virginia. There, he would be formally sentenced for the murder of Kathleen Doyle. In Virginia, Dennis received 2 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. These sentences would ensure that Dennis Bowman would never, ever walk free again under any circumstances. He would die in prison. That was certain. The only question was which prison he would die in. Today, Dennis Bowman is 75 years old. He is currently incarcerated at the River North Correctional Center in Virginia, serving those life sentences for Kathleen's murder. In the aftermath of Dennis's convictions, Andrea's remains needed to be properly laid to rest, and this is where the final heartbreak of this story occurs. Brenda, as Andrea's legal adoptive mother, claimed Andrea's remains from the authorities. She made the decision to have Andrea cremated, which was certainly her right to do. But then Brenda did something that she apparently viewed as a gesture of goodwill, but that Kathy experienced as devastating. Brenda sent a note to Kathy. offering her half of Andrea's ashes. Think about what that meant to Kathy. For 3 decades, she had searched for information about her daughter. She had fought to be heard by investigators who had no legal obligation to listen to her, because she was no longer Andrea's mother in the eyes of the law. She had endured years of being dismissed, years of watching Brenda defend the man who had killed both their daughter, years of knowing that Andrea was out there somewhere, but being powerless to do anything about it. And now, after finally finding Andrea, after finally learning the truth, Brenda was offering to split the ashes as if Andrea were a piece of property to be divided. For Kathy, this felt like a final act of control and division. She felt that Brenda was splitting her daughter in half one more time, just as Dennis had done throughout Andrea's life. Dennis had taken Andrea away from her birth mother through the closed adoption. He had renamed her, erasing the identity of Alexis that Kathy had given her. He had isolated her, controlled her, abused her, and ultimately killed her. And now, even in death, Andrea was being divided between 2 mothers who had such different experiences of her short life. It was a heartbreaking end to a search that had consumed 3 decades of Kathy's life. Kathy had given up her baby girl for adoption all those years ago because she desperately wanted to give her a better life. She had hoped that Andrea would grow up in a stable, loving home with opportunities that Kathy couldn't provide. She had imagined Andrea growing up happy, attending college, falling in love, having her own family, living a full and beautiful life. Instead, she learned that the family she had unknowingly entrusted her daughter to included a predator who had been abusing Andrea and who ultimately killed her at age 14, just as she was beginning to become her own person. Kathy never got to know her daughter. She never got to explain why she had given her up. She never got to tell Andrea that the adoption had come from love, not abandonment. She never got to be part of Andrea's life. And she found her far too late to save her. Today, as I said, Dennis Bowman is 75 years old and incarcerated at a correctional facility in Virginia, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. He will never be released. He will never again walk free. He will die behind bars. Brenda continues to reside in Michigan with their adult daughter, Vanessa. She remains legally married to Dennis, maintaining that bond even now, even after everything. The nature of their current contact, if any, is not public knowledge. The farmhouse on Lincoln Road where Andrea lived and where she was first buried stands as a silent witness to events from over 3 decades ago. The property on 134th Avenue, where Andrea's remains were moved and where she lay hidden for so many years, similarly holds its secrets in the earth. The full extent of Dennis Bowman's crimes will likely never be completely known. Investigators believe there may be other victims who have never been identified, other cases that have never been connected to him. He committed crimes across multiple states over multiple decades. He was convicted for violence in Michigan in the late 1970s and early 1980s, then appears to have committed murder in Virginia in 1980, then killed his own daughter in Michigan in 1989, then continued stalking and breaking into women's homes in the late 1990s. That's a pattern of violence spanning at least 20 years that we know about. Who knows what happened during the gaps in that timeline? Who knows what crimes occurred that were never reported, never investigated, never solved? Andrea's story reminds us of several painful but important truths about our world. Warning signs were present. A child reached out for help 4 months before she disappeared, telling a teacher that she was afraid of her father, that he was abusing her, and the system failed her. The social worker accepted a convenient explanation without digging deeper. No one followed up. No one checked on her again. And 4 months later, she was gone. A birth mother's intuition was proven correct. Kathy spent years insisting that Andrea was buried in a specific location, pointing to satellite images, pleading with police to search. She was dismissed as a grieving mother seeing what she wanted to see. But she was right. She had somehow known, across hundreds of miles and decades of time, exactly where her daughter was buried. Genetic genealogy revolutionized cold case investigation. Without this new technology, Kathleen Doyle's murder would likely have remained unsolved forever. Dennis would have lived out his years as a free man, his crimes unknown, But science caught up to him nearly 4 decades after he thought he had gotten away with murder. And finally, Andrea's story shows us how predators can hide in plain sight. Dennis Bowman volunteered at church. He taught Sunday school. He had character references from priests and friends who genuinely believed he was a good man. He presented himself as a devoted family man while committing unspeakable acts. The most dangerous people are often the ones who know exactly how to blend in, how to appear normal, how to gain trust while concealing who they really are. Andrea Bowman was 14 years old when her life was stolen from her. She never got to finish high school. She never went to prom or graduated or fell in love. She never got to pursue her dreams, discover her passions, become the adult she was meant to be. She never got the chance to search for her birth mother, which was something many people speculated she would do once she was old enough. She never got to hear Kathy explain that giving her up for adoption had been an act of love, not abandonment. All of that potential, all of those possibilities, all of those years of life that should have been hers, stolen by the man who was supposed to protect her. But Andrea's story will not be forgotten. It has been told and retold, shared across true crime communities, featured in documentaries and podcasts and articles. Her face, that school photograph with the green eyes looking up at the camera, has been seen by millions of people over the years. She matters. Her life mattered. And her death led to justice not just for her, but for Kathleen Doyle and possibly other victims who finally saw their cases closed. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Untold Cold Case. I know this was a particularly difficult story, and I appreciate you staying with me through all of it. If this case affected you, if Andrea's story moved you, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about the case, about what stood out to you, about what you think needs to change in our system to protect vulnerable children, and please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another case. We cover cold cases that have been solved after decades, bringing light to stories that deserve to be remembered. I want to hear from you. What do you think about Brenda's unwavering loyalty to Dennis despite all the evidence? Do you think there could be other victims out there that we still don't know about? Should the social worker who investigated Andrea's abuse complaint in November 1988 bear some responsibility for what happened 4 months later? Share your thoughts in the comments. This community is built on discussion and shared interest in seeking justice for victims. These cases also remind us of something crucial. We have to listen when children ask for help. We have to take reports of abuse seriously. We have to dig deeper instead of accepting convenient explanations. We have to be willing to question people even when they seem respectable and trustworthy. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out. Contact local authorities, call a domestic violence hotline, tell a teacher or counselor or trusted adult. Don't wait. Don't hope it will get better on its own. Ask for help. Andrea asked for help, and the system failed her. Let's work to ensure that doesn't happen to other children. Stay safe out there. Take care of your loved ones. Check on the people around you. Sometimes the people who seem fine are the ones who need help the most. And remember, cold cases can be solved even after decades. Justice can come even when it seems impossible. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Thank you for being part of the Untold Cold Case community. Until next time, I'll see you in the next investigation.